धीरे जलना धीरे जलना धीरे जलना, जिंदगी की लो पे जलना, कांच का सपना पिघल न जाए, सोच समझ के आँच रखना, धीरे जलना धीरे जलना धीरे जलना, जिंदगी की लो पे जलना, धीरे जलना धीरे जलना धीरे जलना. Welcome back, you story addicts who've returned for another bout of the heebie-jeebies with me. I'm Sangeeta Bahadur and you are listening to the second episode of my brand new series, Tattle Tales, in which I'm bringing you strange and supernatural stories, both personal and from countries I know and love. In the last episode, I told you a family story that revolved around a ring. Remember? One ring to rule them all. And not just one, but two such stories, because I gave you a bonus in the first episode. Today, I'm sharing with you another family saga, a tale I'm calling Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bride. Courtesy Robert Burns for the poetry lovers among you. Not because there's a phantom tiger involved, but because the protagonist had the personality of one. As for the burning bride bit, well, you'll figure that out for yourself by the end. So let's get on with the story, shall we? This time, we are going back approximately 8 decades, all the way to the 1940s. Around the time India won her independence, 1947, as most of you who are Indians would know, and some others may also have an inkling. My mother would have been a tween or maybe a teen at that time, the youngest of the brood that my Nana, maternal grandfather, produced with the cooperation of the gentle, kind soul he married. Yes, the same Nana who, as a boy, heard Surya Pratap recount his terrifying experience with the ruby ring. By the late 1930s, Nana was a proud father of 6 hopeful children and had turned into a ridiculously successful and filthy rich lawyer. Not naming names here because his still rings a lot of bells among the old elite of Patna. The year my mom turned 4, her 16-year-old elder sister, that was the difference between the eldest and the youngest child, and let's call my aunt Sumati for the sake of convenience. So that was the year Sumati got married into a powerful zamindar family. Many of you would be familiar with the concept of zamindari, but for those of you who are not, zamindars were essentially revenue collectors, huge landowners granted hundreds of acres of land by the British. They were tasked with collecting taxes from those who leased their farms. They yielded a percentage of it to the British and kept the rest for themselves, growing rich and powerful with a socio-political status that rivaled that of minor kings. Vices, big and small, were often a part of their self-indulgent lifestyles. But somehow, Sumati got lucky and escaped the fate of most women in such families. She didn't have to contend with a drunken, philandering and spendthrift husband. The man she married turned out to be handsome, kind, devoted and rather brilliant, my favorite uncle ever. Her father-in-law now was the one who had inherited the typical zamindari vices. He loved fine liquor and finer clothes, enjoyed the thrill of gambling, and notwithstanding his 2 wives, yes, polygamy was legal at that time, he maintained a stunningly lovely dancing girl as his mistress in the small palace he'd constructed for her just across the road from his enormous family home. By the by, I've seen the entire setup for myself, so I know it's all true. Notwithstanding his weaknesses though, he was a kind and generous man who would gift a 1-ounce silver coin every evening to his son's child bride, by today's standards, for bringing him his after-dinner hookah and pan. Yep, that rich. So, where does the tiger come into all this, you ask? Patience, guys. Now that we have set the backdrop, that's exactly where we are headed next. To begin with, let me clarify that the word tiger was just poetic convenience. Actually, this tale involves a tigress of the human variety, none other than my aunt's senior mother-in-law, her husband's stepmother and his father's first wife, who ran the entire household, including her co-wife, stepkids, and the large serving staff with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. Had she been born in the second half of the 20th century, she might have ended up as a gun-toting Lady Dawn. As it was, she was the quintessential dabang matriarch, a typical Bihar UP word you are all familiar with now, thanks to Salman Khan. The closest translation I can think of would be intimidatingly redoubtable. Okay? So dabang was she that she literally bullied her husband into marrying another woman when she discovered that she was barren. She refused to let the family name perish just because she herself couldn't give her husband a son to inherit the zamindari. This tough and, we must admit, really quite selfless decision earned her enormous respect from the entire clan and their retainers. It also garnered her the undying gratitude of her husband, whose sweet new wife, Mausi Sumati's actual mother-in-law, proceeded to present him with an heir and a spare in quick succession. Sumati incidentally married the heir. The second son later tied the knot with my younger Mausi, Sunaina. That's not a concern in this story, except that both Sunaina and her husband, my younger uncle, witnessed the awesome finale with their own eyes and confirmed Aunt Sumati's hair-raising reminiscences. The resident tigress, known more for her sternness and flaring temper than for the softer attributes of her Sautan, co-wife, was widely referred to as Bade Sarkar, literally the big boss. And never mind her good-natured but dissipated spouse, who was the official zamindar. I attribute at least some of that ill temper and challenging behavior to the bitterness of having to share her husband with her fertile co-wife. She was only human, all said and done, and the sacrifice for the family's greater good must have left a bitter taste in her mouth. That was probably what lay at the root of some of the incomprehensible and rather bizarre things she did. Of the various incidents related to the formidable matriarch that both my aunts would recount to us, two have stayed vividly with me. The first is about the division of milk, yes, milk, between the two wives. You see, a small herd of purebred cows was kept on the sprawling premises to supply around 40 liters of fresh milk to the household every day. Careful to avoid even the appearance of bias, the zamindar had decreed that the milk be divided equally between the two wives. Thankfully, he didn't include the mistress, probably to avoid shattering his spouse's dignified pretense that the woman didn't exist. Anyway, the second wife's share of 20 liters was obviously used for her two sons and their retinue of servants, teachers, and visitors. The remaining 20 liters were religiously delivered to Bade Sarkar, who, unlike her co-wife, didn't have the elaborate trappings of children. She didn't ask for a smaller share, however, or send the milk over to the less fortunate. Compassion obviously wasn't one of her strong points. She decided instead to plant a sapling that would grow into a big jackfruit tree in the fullness of time. Rather than water, the 20 liters of milk were poured into the roots of the sapling every day for years. What a waste, you say? Well, yes, that was an act worthy of Queen Marie Antoinette herself, the one who suggested that the poor opt for eating cake if they didn't have bread, right? That one. But I've sampled the annual bounty yielded by the spoiled rotten tree, and I can assure you that I have never tasted a jackfruit sweeter, juicier, or more melt in the mouth than the ones that sprouted on its milk-fed branches. The other story now is far grimmer. It seems that on a chilly winter night, Bade Sarkar decided, for whatever reason, that she wanted her dinner under the stars, in the big courtyard surrounding her luxurious quarters, rather than in the lonely splendor of her dining room. Her minions ran around setting up a table for her as well as a borsi to keep her warm as she ate. What's a borsi, you ask? Well, it's kind of a large iron wok used in those days for lighting a peat and wood fire to act as a heater. The leisurely pace of a meal, however, resulted in the flames gradually simmering down to embers. Rather than moving inside at that point, Bade Sarkar chose to have the peat in the borsi replenished. Since it was dinner time for the whole family and their numerous hangers-on, the servants were all busy running around, and for 5 whole minutes, nobody responded to her imperious summons. By the time a hapless and harried young maid finally ran into the courtyard with a small sack of peat, Bade Sarkar's temper was rivaling that of the fiery embers in the borsi. As the frightened girl knelt to unknot the little bag, Bade Sarkar stood up, picked up the borsi with its burning hot contents, and simply upended it on her head. The agonized shrieks of the poor girl brought everyone running, but much too late. She was rushed to the nearest doctor with terrible third-degree burns that might have killed her even in a modern hospital. In a remote little town in the early 1940s, it was a death warrant. She succumbed to her injuries before the night was out. But was a police complaint lodged against Bade Sarkar? No. Was she even prosecuted, let alone indicted for murder? What are you saying? Wasn't she the wife of one of the richest and most powerful zamindars in the region? Who dare accuse her? The matter was hushed up, the maid's family handsomely paid off by the exasperated zamindar, and nobody ever mentioned the crime again, except in whispers within the family itself. Bade Sarkar, of course, behaved like nothing had happened. She showed no remorse, no regret, and it was business as usual in the large establishment. I have always believed that our scary denouement of today, which you're going to hear now, was at least partially karma, ultimately biting Bade Sarkar in the ass. A year or so after India's independence, when Mausi Sumati was already a mother of two, with a third on the way, Bade Sarkar finally decided to call it a day. She shed her mortal coils after a brief illness. Sunaina, my younger aunt, who'd been allowed to complete her inter, what we would call high school now, before being married off, was still a bride, and their own mother-in-law was getting on in years. The burden of managing the death rituals therefore fell on Sumati as the older daughter-in-law. Bade Sarkar's body, accompanied by relatives and retainers, was carried in state to the town's cremation grounds and laid on the expensive sandalwood chitta, funeral pyre, hurriedly assembled for her. The day had started out dark, cloudy and windy, and the weather stayed fretful as her husband and stepsons gave the mukhagni, the first touch of flame, to the pyre. As the wood began to burn in earnest, the sky suddenly opened, rain falling in sheets and drenching everybody within seconds. For a while, the miserable mourners waited for the torrential downpour to stop. When nothing of the kind happened, a command decision was taken by the zamindar. His departed wife, he pronounced, would burn well enough without their vigil, and all of them dying of pneumonia would not bring her back. Logical, right? Since the formidable Bade Sarkar had been more feared than loved anyway, the motion was seconded enthusiastically by the majority. My dutiful uncles were a little reluctant to leave the job half done. However, they were swept along by the crowd with assurances that they would all return on the morrow to collect the ashes. Besides, it was already well past midday and everybody was looking forward to the wake being hosted by the family. The rain had stopped by the time they reached home, and a bath and change of clothing later, the 100 or so mourners sat down to eat. An elaborate meal comprising of Bade Sarkar's favorite dishes was served by a small army of servants. Sumati's guesstimate of the quantities required proved gratifyingly accurate, till more of the zamindar's acquaintances and hangers-on began walking in, determined to register their somber presence and, of course, to enjoy the sumptuous feast. All calculations gone haywire, Sumati asked her sister-in-law to supervise the kitchen as the harried cooking staff kneaded more dough and chopped and stirred more vegetables and spices into what was already simmering on the half-dozen cooking fires blazing in the cavernous kitchen. The panicked serving staff reported that more rice, Bihar's staple of choice, and dal were also urgently required. Sumati, with a maid in tow, rushed to the big bhandar ghar or storehouse at the other end of the vast courtyard to fetch the grains. Since servants were not, for whatever reason, allowed inside, the maid waited below the steps and only my aunt went in, carrying 2 containers for the rice and the lentils. The bhandar ghar was dark and gloomy, the thick stone walls keeping it cool, and a single ventilator set high up to let in some fresh air. A lantern swung from a large nail in the wall, casting a dim circle of golden light. Sumati stepped straight towards the big gunny bags containing the fine basmati rice being served to the guests, picked up one of the containers and dipped it into the sack. And suddenly, out of the deep shadows to her right, a hand shot out and curled around her upper arm in a vice-like grip. Startled, Sumati glanced at the hand and, to her vast credit, neither screamed nor collapsed in a dead faint. Anybody else, let alone a 4 months pregnant woman, would have. I would have, because I'm an unashamed scaredy cat. My Mausi, though, was a dabang woman in her own right, not given to vicious temper tantrums, no, but certainly born with the indomitable courage of a lioness. Maybe that was why Bade Sarkar had always liked her. And maybe that was why she was the one chosen for this chilling encounter. Because the hand gripping her arm was half burnt, the smoking flesh hanging from the exposed bones. The arm to which it was attached was no better. The blackened skin peeling to reveal the bubbling, half-cooked meat and muscle, the white bone gleaming through the sickening mess. The rest of the body and the face itself were in a similar state. Patches of crisped grey hair still clung to the remnants of the scalp. Bits of shriveled silk were stuck to the charred and blistered body. There were some black beads and bits of gold embedded in the flesh around the apparition's neck that looked suspiciously like a melted Mangal Sutra, a special necklace worn by married women in India. Now, don't ask me how Sumati still retained enough wit to notice such details, but, well, heart of a lioness, right? And she thought, the gods help me, it's Bade Sarkar. A semi-roasted version of her, true, but the ghastly face still retained the whisper of a resemblance to the living woman. One eyeball had popped, but death had not doused the brooding fire in the remaining one. That is, if she were dead. Disturbed by the thought, but completely unafraid, Sumati looked the glowering apparition in the single eye and demanded crisply, "Aren't you supposed to be dead, Bade Sarkar?" Yes, even the sons and their wives called her that. "You were carried to the Shamshan Ghat by your husband and his sons just a few hours ago, and your cremation rituals were supervised by the family priest. So, what are you doing here? I'm sure what she really meant to ask was, so why haven't you turned to ashes yet? But didn't want to sound disrespectful. Look at me, grated the shade or zombie or corpse. Sumati wasn't quite sure what she was. Can you see what has been done to me? Hard to miss, Sumati muttered, patting her belly to soothe the babe within. What happened? She asked, unwilling to get into the question of the lady being dead or alive. They just left me there, wailed Bade Sarkar, or what was left of her. They placed me on the pyre and lit it. But then it started pouring and they turned around and simply sprinted away. Even my husband, the pitiful debauch that he is, probably couldn't wait to crawl into that Nachaniya's lap. Nachaniya being a euphemism for a harlot. In this case, her husband's mistress, whom she had never acknowledged by word or deed when alive. Evidently, death had loosened Bade Sarkar's tongue. Everyone, continued the spectre, behaved as though the rain might melt them into a puddle, just like the fire was melting me. Not one of them turned around to check on me or the condition of my chitta. No one returned to ensure that the rain hadn't put out the flames and that my body had been fully consumed. Nobody cared that the fire went out midway when my remains were only half cremated. Even the embers were doused by the storm. This, she gestured at herself with her other hand, never letting go of Sumati's arm. This is how I am now. Not merely ugly and reeking like a roasting pig, but also trapped in this burnt body, unable to move on because of my impure state. My ashes need to be submerged in the Ganga before the Shraddh can be held. Without that, I can't cross into the next world. That's why, she whispered pleadingly, a tone Sumati had never heard her use in her life. I have come seeking your help, daughter-in-law. I couldn't connect to anyone else. I know that I'm not universally liked, but even so, is this what I deserve? At this point, Sumati set aside the niggling and rather horrifying idea that maybe Bade Sarkar had been misdiagnosed with death, that she'd woken up on the simmering pyre in that unenviable condition and had somehow shuffled home, dripping burnt flesh and gristle along the way. Obviously, her step-mother-in-law was very much dead, and this was her spirit or essence or something along those lines that was standing before her. That was why the smoking, cracked hand clasped around her arm hadn't burnt it, and also why, as she suddenly noticed, the Bhandar Ghar had turned icy cold. Compassion for the departed and rather ill-used soul overwhelmed her, along with sheer outrage towards the mourners, including her husband and in-laws, who had behaved in a totally unacceptable manner. How dare they sit out there, chomping on the delicious spread prepared in the name of the poor woman they hadn't even bothered to cremate properly. Yes, she had been feared more than loved, and had done some rather reprehensible things, but nobody deserved to be abandoned, half grilled, half burnt on a funeral pyre. "Let go of my arm, Bade Sarkar," Aunt Sumati said firmly. "If you hold me here, how do you expect me to go out and take those irresponsible men to task? What they have done is disgraceful, and the situation needs to be rectified immediately. I promise you that I'll send them back to the cremation ground right away and tell them not to set foot in this house again till they finish what they started. Come rain or shine, before the sun sets on this day, you will be no more than a heap of ashes. They'll all leave right now, including father-in-law. And you're wrong about him, you know. He isn't with the Nachaniya at all. If it's any comfort, he's out there with the others, weeping and eating your favorite dishes. Release me." Now, whether it was Sumati's assurance or the gratifying news that her husband wasn't consorting with his mistress, Bade Sarkar did indeed let go. She didn't go away though. As Sumati left the storehouse, she sensed the lingering presence and the fulminating gaze stalking her every step of the way. Once outside, Sumati collared the wall-eyed, trembling maid who had evidently heard, if not seen, the ghostly visitor. She frog-marched the girl across the courtyard all the way to the long veranda where the men were still eating, and sent her to fetch her husband and brother-in-law. The two stunned and unnerved brothers heard the incredible account of what had just transpired and received an earful from an outraged Sumati. It says something about the dabangness of my still quite young aunt that it didn't even occur to either of the men to question either her sanity or her worth. With practiced efficiency, my uncles broke up the rather maudlin lunch and swept off their confused father and many of the original pallbearers back to the cremation ground. As they confessed to Sumati later, they found the chitta in exactly the condition the apparition had described. A part of it still smouldering, but most of it snuffed out by the rain and the wind. Some of the logs had rolled to the ground, revealing Bade Sarkar's scorched but still recognizable corpse. The bridal sari she'd been draped in was mostly burnt off, and the half-melted Mangal Sutra was embedded in her peeling skin, just the way Sumati had seen her in the storehouse. The shocked and sheepish gathering helped fetch more wood and light the pyre again, and this time stayed well past midnight till the body was totally consumed by the flames. The ashes, of course, could only be gathered the next evening when the embers had cooled. By the time the somber group trudged tiredly home, the grey of dawn was already lightening the eastern horizon. The household hadn't slept at all, of course, and the servants rushed around preparing and serving tea and snacks to the mourners, while my older Mosa stayed to supervise the hospitality and bid farewell to relatives and retainers as they left. His brother went in search of Sumati to report on the success of their grim mission. He found the two sisters waiting together in Sumati's bedchamber. At her request, the couple accompanied Sumati to the courtyard abutting the storehouse. There, with a faint pink smearing the edge of the sky, Sumati called out in a strong voice, "Bade Sarkar, I have fulfilled the promise I made you when you came to me to ask for help. Your husband and sons went back and relit your chitta. And this time, they waited till your body was reduced to ashes. Something they should have done the first time around," she added pointedly as she gave her embarrassed brother-in-law a stern look, "and saved you the trouble of coming back here to demand your right to an honorable cremation. Now that it has happened, I beg you to forgive your very contrite family and this household for the shabby way you were treated in death. Please do not hold a grudge. It would be unbecoming of a lady of your stature. If you've forgiven us, please do not linger in this house or anywhere on this estate," she amended hastily, not wanting the vengeful spirit to drift over to the mistress's mansion and create a ruckus there. Something dignity had prevented her from doing while alive. "I know you can hear me, Bade Sarkar, because I can still sense your presence. I also know that you've granted my plea and will move on. I'm merely requesting you to give me a sign, something tangible that we can all see rather than just feel, an assurance that you have actually left and will not return. You have reigned over this household for decades. Do not tarnish your memory by terrorizing it now." Sumati, of course, was being diplomatic. As you've all heard, Bade Sarkar had ruled the Zamindar's sprawling establishment with an iron fist for decades, and fear had formed a good part of her aura. However, you don't insult a terrorist when you are negotiating the release of hostages, do you? And that was precisely what the family was, with Bade Sarkar haunting the place. There was a long silence when Sumati finished speaking. The new day itself seemed to wait breathlessly along with the tense trio for the tigress's response. Then, from the lightning skies above, a pair of wooden slippers, popularly called khadaun or paduka, came crashing down. They fell to the ground with the sound of a gunshot, barely inches from Sumati's feet, and narrowly missing braining them all. Bade Sarkar throwing a final tantrum, perhaps? As the three of them stared bemusedly at the slippers, they realized that these looked exactly like Bade Sarkar's favorite pair, the ones that sported a coating of mother of pearl around the edges and had toe holders made of gleaming white moonstone. She would wear them for religious festivals when she went with her husband and co-wife to attend the special puja ceremonies performed by their family priest in their own sumptuous temple with its marble floors and Venetian mirrors and Belgian glass chandeliers. And yes, it still stands. And I have visited it many times as a child and even later. The sulking phantom may well have dug the padukas out of her closet to throw at her husband's family from another woman, except that these slippers were each the size of my aunt's arm, a good 2 feet long and proportionately broad, made by some whimsical carpenter for a mythical giant. During the minutes that followed, the silence was so intense that it seemed to implode. Sumati Mausi swore that she felt the brooding, overbearing presence of her departed stepmother-in-law slowly drain out of the sprawling manor like water flowing through a sieve. The air lightened and brightened. The sleepy chirping of birds, the lowing of cows, and the faint voices of servants working in other parts of the house became audible again. Mausi Sunaina and her husband, far more shaken than Aunt Sumati with her nerves of steel, drew in a shaken breath. Whew. My wary younger uncle tried lifting the khadaus, but found them far heavier than they had any right to be. So they were left with no option but to call in my older uncle, along with a couple of sturdy man servants whose eyes virtually popped at the sight of the oversized slippers. All that Sumati said to her astonished husband was, "Bade Sarkar, she has evidently left." He understood her perfectly and could never appreciate her enough for saving them all from the wrath of his stepmother's dishonored and hence vengeful soul. The 4 men, watched by the entire retinue of wide-eyed servants, hauled the pair of enormous padukas to the storage room reserved for the family's memorabilia and placed them in a prominent corner. True to her word, Bade Sarkar never returned to the manor she had called home for over 6 decades, since the day she had stepped inside as a 12-year-old bride. There were no further hauntings, although whenever I went to visit Mausi Sumati and happened to walk alone through the big courtyard surrounding Bade Sarkar's personal quarters, I'd inevitably end up with goosebumps and a spine crackling with ice. Maybe it was just my imagination because I had heard that story so many times. Or maybe the burning bright aura of the tigress could never quite be erased, even after her spirit had gone on to wear another body and another face in another life. Of one thing I've always been sure: moksha or nirvana had neither been offered to nor accepted by a soul like hers. A disconcerting mix of hero and villain, Bade Sarkar still had far too many karmic debts left to pay and collect. Liberation from the cycle of life and death was probably nowhere on her spiritual bucket list for the foreseeable future. Well, so that's it for today, folks. I hope that you've enjoyed this thrilling and chilling story, this ghastly and ghostly tale from my family's repertoire of similar experiences, as much as you did the very first story I told you. If you liked the story and the way it has been told, please do like, subscribe, and share this episode and the previous one with your friends, relatives, children, cats, dogs, and whoever else you think enjoys the idea of something going bump in the night. And I hope that I'll see you all back here when I come back with yet another tale, either inspired by something that a family member, a relative, or a friend has told me, or borrowed from the urban legend, folk tales, ghost stories, etc. that I've heard during my various postings abroad. I haven't decided yet, but whatever it is, I can assure you that it will be as entertaining as this one and the previous one, and that it will keep tugging you back to listen to the next one when I come back and talk to you again. In the meanwhile, goodbye, take care of yourselves, and think a little about what lies beyond the realm of your immediate experiences. It's something to wonder about, right? As Hamlet says, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So just think about it. Bye.